Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ken Kimmell, and I'm the president of the Union of Concerned Scientists. In a moment, I will introduce our panelists, but welcome to this call, and thank you all for taking the time out of your what is undoubtedly a busy pre-holiday day to be part of this webinar. So next Monday in Paris, the city that's still reeling from a vicious terrorist attack, will host a 2-week summit on climate change. It's called the Conference of the Parties, or COP21. And I think everyone would agree that it is one of the most important international gatherings of our lifetime. At stake is nothing less than whether our world leaders will commit to an agreement that can protect our children and their children from the worst effects of climate change. If the agreement is successful, we will have made a meaningful down payment on our obligation to future generations. If we fail, future generations will undoubtedly shake their heads in shame that we didn't rise to the challenge that Paris provided for us. So today we have several distinguished experts from UCS to sort out some of the big questions. What exactly will happen in Paris? What does success look like? What are the barriers? What are the opportunities? What is the role that the U.S. Can and should play? And also what happens after Paris, both internationally and in the United States. So joining us will be 3 experts from UCS, and I'll introduce them and then ask one to get started. We have Alden Meyer here today, who is our Director of Strategy and Policy, who is an internationally respected expert on international climate diplomacy, and he will give an overview of what's at stake in Paris and how it will play out. We'll then turn to Anair, our Deputy Director of Transportation, who will talk about the crucial role of transportation and fuels policies in combating climate change. Then we'll turn to Rachel Cleetus, our Lead Economist and Climate Manager, who will talk about electricity generation and power plants and renewable energy and various other associated topics. And after each has given a short presentation, we'll turn it over for questions. So without further ado, Alden, could I ask you to give us an overview of what's going to happen in Paris?
Sure, Ken, thanks, and welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us today. As some of you know, I've been involved in this process since it began in 1990 with the original negotiations over the Rio Earth Treaty signed by the first President Bush in Rio de Janeiro. And this is one of the biggest meetings in that 25 years of climate negotiations. It's really the biggest one since 2009 when, of course, we had the first meeting that President Obama participated in as U.S. President in Copenhagen, Denmark. The atmosphere is very different than it was 6 years ago in the run-up to Copenhagen. There's much greater public awareness and concerns about climate impacts. Energy efficiency and renewable energy solutions are much more competitive with coal, oil, and gas than they were back then. And virtually every major leader from both developed and developing countries is calling for enhanced action. So it's pretty clear that there is going to be an agreement at the end of the 2 weeks of negotiations in Paris, but how effective that agreement will be is still all to play for. Just to give you a sense of what's happened just in the last couple of months, we've had a joint statement from the U.S. and China, the world's 2 major emitters and largest economies, illustrating areas of agreement on climate policy, and in China's case announcing that it would institute a national cap and trade regime on carbon emissions starting in 2017. Also matching the U.S. and putting forward $3 billion in finance for developing country action on climate change and actions to deal with the impacts of climate change. A number of other key bilateral meetings with President Hollande of France, President Xi of China, Prime Ministers Cameron of England and Modi of the government of India. There was a major luncheon in New York around the opening of the General Assembly on September 27th, where over 40 leaders got together and called for a transformational signal coming out of Paris to business and investors that the era of fossil fuels needs to come to an end. Of course, you had Pope Francis's speech to Congress and to the UN General Assembly, as well as a declaration by Islamic scholars and a number of other initiatives by the faith community. And we've had a continuing wave of announcements by businesses, cities, states, and provinces. Just this weekend, Alberta in Canada was the latest to step up to the plate and talk about what it will do at home to deal with the climate problem. So there's a lot of indications here of momentum. And of course, over 150 countries have now put forward their proposed commitments going into Paris. This is a little bit different than past negotiations where the actual commitments were worked out at the meeting. In this case, countries have already indicated in advance of the start of the Paris talks what they are willing to do going forward from 2020. The good news is that you've got over 150 countries representing about 90% of global emissions. So the participation rate is very high, and that part of the process is working. But the problem, of course, is that while the pledges would reduce projected temperature increases from roughly the 6-degree Fahrenheit business as usual pathway, they're not yet enough to get us on the pathway to keep warming below 2 degrees Celsius or about 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit. There is a gap there. It's been documented by the United Nations Environment Program. It's been documented by the Secretariat of the climate negotiations, and there's a lot of variance in some of these estimates, but roughly we're about a third of the way to where we need to get over the next 15 years as a result of the pledges that countries have already put on the table. So what we'll be working for in Paris is a package of measures to address this remaining ambition gap. First, we'll be looking for a long-term goal in the Paris Agreement that sort of acts as a North Star about where we need to go over the next several decades to get a grip on this problem and avoid the worst impacts of climate change. There's a lot of different formulations in the current draft negotiating text on this. Decarbonization of the global economy is one, low carbon transformation, carbon neutrality. It's going to take some tough negotiations to get agreement on the language, but I think we'll get there by the end of 2 weeks. We'll be fighting for language that sends a strong signal to investors, the business community, and the public that the age of fossil fuels needs to come to an end by somewhere around the middle of this century. Second, we'll be looking for a commitment to revise and revisit the post-2020 commitments by the end of this decade. Every 5 years, we think countries need to come together and take a collective look at how well we're doing and try to up their ambition. We've seen tremendous reductions in renewable technology costs just over the last several years. I think that, combined with growing public awareness and support for action on climate change, will allow not only the U.S. but countries like China, India, Brazil, and others to put greater ambition on the table by 2020 than they think they can do now. There's general support among countries going into Paris for a collective review of adequacy, but there is some resistance from some countries on the notion that they should be encouraged or required to strengthen and revise their commitments as a result of that review. So that will be a tough issue. There's a number of developing countries, India, Mexico, Indonesia, and others, that have put forward sort of two-track proposed commitments, what they can do with their own resources on an unconditional basis versus what additional actions they could take if they had expanded financial and technology support. India is a good case there, where they are trying to develop 175 gigawatts of new renewable capacity by early in the next decade. Just to give you a sense of scale, that's roughly 1/4 of the total installed capacity of the United States for generation of power right now. So it's a huge commitment, but they've been very clear that it will take help in terms of financing and technology from outside of India to help them do that. So we'll be working with the U.S., Europe, Japan, other industrialized countries on how we can have some processes coming out of Paris that try to match finance and technology to those conditional offers and unlock some additional ambition. There are some other tough issues on the table. What's the direction of financial commitments from the U.S. and other developed countries after 2020? You may recall that in Copenhagen, Secretary Clinton and President Obama led a coalition of developed countries to put on the table a pledge of $100 billion annually by 2020 in private and public sector finance to help developing countries both install clean technology and constrain their emissions of greenhouse gases, as well as to ramp up strategies to deal with the impacts of climate change. The French are working on a pathway to show how that $100 billion goal will be met, but of course now the question is what happens after 2020. Will climate finance continue to ramp up for that level? When will countries be expected to put specific new finance commitments on the table? That's going to be a tough issue, and of course here in the U.S., this is one of the areas where President Obama and his administration does not have the unilateral ability to act. Under our Constitution, the Congress has the power of the purse, and they're having a tough time in the Obama administration even getting Congress to appropriate the initial commitment to the new Greek climate fund that President Obama put forward earlier this year. So I think climate finance will be one of the last night issues in Paris, and we know there's going to be some drama around that. There always is, but there's a lot of discussions, and we'll be in the middle of those. The other issue I want to mention is what's called loss and damage, which is the costs of dealing with both sudden disasters like typhoons and downpours, as well as what's called slow onset impacts like sea level rise and drought. Because we know that no matter how aggressive we're able to get on reducing emissions and how much support we're able to provide for developing countries to make their economies and communities more resistant to the impacts of climate change, there still will be growing impacts over the next several decades. This issue of loss and damage almost caused the collapse of the talks 3 years ago in Doha, Qatar, and it's still a very tough issue. The small island states, the least developed countries, and other vulnerable countries are demanding that there be some language in the Paris Agreement that establishes loss and damage as a third pillar of the climate regime alongside mitigation and adaptation. But developed countries, especially the U.S., are very concerned that this could create grounds for liability, sort of compensation for historical emissions, which are causing much of this problem and these damages for developing countries. So that will be a tough issue, and they'll need to have a compromise at the end of the 2 weeks on how they address that in Paris. So to sum up, Paris is going to be an important moment, but it's not going to guarantee the results we need. It's going to be very important to build momentum coming out of Paris. We're working with a number of companies, cities, and others on announcements that they can make in the weeks and months after Paris to demonstrate that Paris sent a powerful signal about the need for aggressive action. There will be a big meeting in Davos, Switzerland at the end of January, the annual World Economic Forum, which will be an important moment for a number of coordinated actions by the international business community. There will be summits next year. The most significant probably will be the G20 Leaders Summit, the 20 most powerful economies in the world, and China is taking over the presidency of the G20 from Turkey in 2016, followed by Germany in 2017, and those two countries are already talking about how they can move a proactive climate agenda in the G20 process. Of course, we've got several significant elections around the world in 2016, including a small one here in the United States, and we'll be working to lay the groundwork for the next president and administration to build on President Obama's domestic climate action plan, because it's very clear, even to meet the 26 to 28% emission reduction by 2025 that the President's put on the table, will take additional action above and beyond the actions that Don and Rachel will talk about in a minute under the President's Climate Action Plan. We'll also be working to build public and congressional support for additional finance and technology assistance to developing countries, both for mitigation actions and for addressing the impacts of climate change. So let me stop there, Ken, and turn it over to the next speaker to go into some of the details on some of the action steps.
So Alden, thank you for that great overview. We're going to just transition now a little bit to a more granular look at the U.S. As Alden mentioned, we have made a pledge to reduce our own emissions by 26 to 28% below 2005 levels by 2025. As Alden mentioned, there will be future policies that will be important to secure that. But the good news is that the lion's share of those reductions are locked in by existing policies. And this didn't happen by accident. It happened partly because we have leadership in Washington that really understands this problem and wants to do something about it. But it also happened because groups like UCS have fought for years for the policies that would put us in a position to make a pledge of this nature. And in particular, two policies stand out that you'll hear about from our experts. One is fuel economy standards that will roughly double the miles per gallon that you can go, and also the Clean Power Plan, which Rachel will talk about. These are two regulatory actions of the Obama administration. They have the force of law behind them, and UCS has played a major role both in advocating for these policies and actually shaping the design and level of stringency. So I'm going to turn it over to Don and ask him to talk about the greenhouse gas emissions that come from the transportation sector, what the U.S. is doing about it, and maybe a little bit about UCS's role in getting to those solutions.
Great. Thanks, Ken. We've been making some substantial progress in the transportation sector during the last several years in terms of policy development, particularly on the regulatory side. As Ken mentioned, the passenger car and truck fuel economy standards that have been adopted under the Obama administration would roughly double fuel economy of new vehicles by 2025 compared to 2010 levels. And in addition to those standards, there's also been some progress on heavy-duty truck fuel economy, so tractor trailers. And we've also seen states really stepping up on additional policies around electric vehicles and deploying and developing cleaner fuel. So I'll touch on a few of these things to just give an example of where some of the leadership of both the states and the federal government are going to be helping bring some transportation solutions to Paris. On the fuel economy standards, the latest round was adopted in 2012. And those extend out for new vehicles through 2025, and they primarily are based on improvements in conventional vehicle technology. So that includes hybrids, it includes better and more efficient gasoline engines, better aerodynamics, and those types of benefits. And those have been in place for several years now, and we've already seen significant progress in the industry. Automakers are meeting, in fact, they're actually ahead of the standard by about a year, and currently the average new vehicle gets around 24 to 25 miles per gallon. That's up from about 20 miles per gallon in 2010. So just in 5 years, we've seen a significant improvement in new vehicle fuel economy. And we have also seen a number of vehicles introduced that are exceeding even the 2020 levels that are required for the fleet as a whole. For example, last year, 10% of all the vehicles sold in the U.S. actually are compliant with standard levels that are set for 2020 and beyond. So we're in really good shape here on the light-duty side. One of the challenges will be going forward in the U.S. is maintaining these standards. We're seeing pressure from the auto industry pushing back as these standards undergo a midterm evaluation, which will be happening over the next year or two. So it'll be critical that the U.S. really continues its leadership and keeps these standards in place through the next administration and through 2025. On another key strategy, the Obama administration has also been putting forward the first ever heavy-duty fuel economy and greenhouse gas standards for big rigs, basically tractor trailers and other large trucks. Again, those have gone through 2 rounds of standards. The latest is still under development and has not yet been finalized, but UCS has been playing a key role in really assessing what the potential technology improvements are for heavy-duty trucks. Just to give you an example of the impact, heavy-duty vehicles account for about 25% of all the fuel used on U.S. roads, but they only account for 7% of the vehicles. So there's significant benefits in terms of climate and fuel economy, fuel savings by improving the fuel economy of these vehicles. We did an analysis looking at what the potential is for these technologies through 2025 and found heavy-duty trucks could be 40% cleaner, produce 40% less emissions by 2025 compared to 2010 levels, and that's the level we've been advocating for with the agencies, doing technical analysis and advocacy, really building the case for setting the most stringent standards possible on the heavy-duty side. And this is really a key leverage point in addition to our own domestic fuel consumption. Heavy-duty and freight transportation is even a larger share of transportation emissions in other countries, and so U.S. leadership on this issue is really, really critical. Just quickly, there's been significant developments in the electric vehicle market as well over the past 5 years. Federal tax credits for these plug-in and fuel cell vehicles have been a key driver for that, but it's really been the state leadership that has driven auto industry investments, bringing vehicles to market, and giving consumers the opportunity to buy different types of zero-emission tailpipe vehicles, including vehicles like the Chevy Volt and the Nissan Leaf, which have now been in the market for about 5 years and are actually undergoing a second or third generation development. So we're seeing significant improvements in battery technology and range for these vehicles. So California has been a key leader on this. They've been regulating the auto industry to ensure that they invest and bring these vehicles to market. And 9 other states in the U.S. have also adopted these standards. And the zero-emission vehicle standards, as they're called, would essentially require, in these states that have adopted the standard, up to 15% of new vehicles sold would need to be plug-in hybrid, battery electric, or fuel cell vehicles by 2025. So this is really a key driver for some near-term development in terms of the technology, but also setting the stage for much deeper reductions beyond 2025. On the fuel side, again, states are really taking a lead here. In addition to the federal renewable fuel standard, states like California and Oregon have developed their own policies, which are performance-based carbon metrics for cleaning up and reducing emissions from the fuel sector. So low carbon fuel standards have been passed in both of those states, and other states are interested in doing the same, and I think those are really having an effect on the investments going into next generation biofuels, cellulosic fuel plants for reducing emissions from ethanol production, but also expanding the role of what are commonly called drop-in fuels, ones that can directly replace gasoline and diesel. So we're seeing some significant advancements there, with just recently a new plant announced, an opening cellulosic plant, and there's about 4 or 5 plants that are coming online. So a little bit later than had been hoped, but there's definitely some momentum now, and we're seeing some positive developments on the low carbon fuel side. Overall, I would say these accomplishments are encouraging, and they put us on a trajectory, as Ken said, in terms of we've got policies on the books that lock in significant emission reductions from the transportation sector. But of course, nothing is certain, and there is significant industry opposition going forward, attempts to weaken these fuel economy standards from the auto industry, as well as significant pushback from the oil industry, fighting against state and federal policies that are intended to lower the carbon emissions from petroleum fuels or biofuels, and so these are continuing to be threats to the progress we've made. So I think going into Paris, the U.S. From the transportation side has some significant concrete emission reductions that we're bringing to the table, and it's important in these negotiations as well that other countries are following the U.S. lead, because that's going to help us, in fact, continue to push back against the industry, pushback on these standards, bringing other countries along, following along the footsteps for fuel economy standards and vehicle electrification will ensure that there's momentum globally to move these technologies forward. So just to wrap up quickly, we have a half the oil plan, which some of you may be familiar with, which essentially looks at the potential to cut our projected oil use in half by 2035 in the U.S. And by 2025, we can get to about 30% reduction, and many of these policies are really employed to get to that level. By continuing and expanding these policies beyond 2025, we can be on track to cutting our oil use in half, projected oil use in half by 2035. So it's these international commitments that can help the U.S. keep our current trajectory. And an example of something concrete there is California's kind of reached out to international other countries and other jurisdictions to work together in expanding electric vehicle deployment, for example. So lots of positive sides on the transportation sector. And so with that, I will pass it back to Ken to introduce Rachel. Thank you.
Okay. Don, thank you so much. So transportation emissions in the United States are about 30% of the overall problem. Electricity generation is the source of about 40% of our emissions. And so I'm going to turn it over to Rachel to talk about some of the things that the United States has done to cut its emissions from the electricity sector, and to have Rachel talk about that and UCS's role and what she sees on the international horizon.
Great. Thank you very much, Ken, and thank you all for joining the webinar today. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some pretty historic changes that are already underway in the U.S. power sector. As many of you might be aware, we've seen coal, which used to be the dominant source of U.S. power generation, fall in its contribution. The economics of coal have been steadily eroding. Coal is now down to below 40% of our share of the electricity mix. As recently as 10 years ago, it was half of the share of our electricity mix. And in the meantime, what we're seeing as we see these aging, polluting coal-fired power plants retiring, many of them over 40, 50 years old, we're seeing other cleaner sources of generation step in. The big one has been natural gas because of the falling costs of natural gas due to the shale gas boom. But what's also very significant is we've seen pretty tremendous growth in renewable energy as the costs have been declining dramatically. In fact, in 2015, we're going to have renewable energy outpace capacity additions from renewable energy outpace natural gas. Wind alone is projected to exceed natural gas capacity additions. And that's pretty exciting because it points out an opportunity for us to clean up our electricity mix. And that's the opportunity into which the Clean Power Plan has stepped in. Some of you might be aware that in early August this year, the Environmental Protection Agency finalized the first ever carbon dioxide limits on power plants in the U.S. These rules have been a long time in coming. There have been a series of legal requirements that were created. There was a Supreme Court ruling which established the fact that carbon dioxide emissions did endanger human health and welfare, and that because of that, EPA did need to move to address these emissions. EPA subsequently established a scientific basis on which to move forward. So years later, we now have this final Clean Power Plan. And what the Clean Power Plan does is set up a very flexible framework for states to cut their carbon emissions from power plants. The plan basically establishes state-by-state targets for cutting emissions. And collectively, nationally, this will reduce power sector emissions by an estimated 32% below 2005 levels by 2030. So that's important. We can clearly go further and need to go further if we want to meet our climate goals, but that's a pretty significant commitment, and it's, as Ken pointed out, a key portion of the U.S. economy-wide commitment that it made as part of the UNFCCC announcement, where it said it would cut its emissions by 26 to 28% by 2025. This Clean Power Plan, which goes after a good 40% of our CO2 emissions, is a linchpin of that national commitment. What it does is allow states to employ a number of options to cut their emissions. They can ramp up cleaner sources of energy like renewables. They can invest in greater energy efficiency. They can continue to retire coal plants and shift to cleaner sources, including energy efficiency, renewable energy, and natural gas. They can bring online nuclear plants that are currently under construction. UCS played a very active role when the draft Clean Power Plan was announced last summer. We saw a huge opportunity, a missed opportunity to expand the role for renewables in the final Clean Power Plan, and we advocated pretty strongly for the final Clean Power Plan to have a bigger role for renewable energy and to limit the risks of over-reliance on natural gas. And we're very pleased with the final Clean Power Plan because it did take a number of steps in that direction. And we are now moving towards a strategy to go into states, and as they pull together their compliance plans over the next couple of years, we're advocating for renewables and efficiency to play a major role in how states comply. The other very significant thing that the Clean Power Plan does is it allows the option, if states want to choose it, to take advantage of multi-state trading to find the most cost-effective ways to cut emissions. And that's important because a number of, we already have real-world examples here in the U.S., both through California as well as the RGGI states, which have come together in this 9-state compact, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, to cut power sector emissions through a cap-and-trade program. And both these programs, the one in California and the one in the Northeast, have been around for a number of years and have shown that it's cost-effective to cut emissions and that we can use those carbon revenues for public benefit. So in the RGGI states, for example, they're on track to cut their emissions 50% by 2020, below 2005 levels. And they've put millions of dollars into energy efficiency, help for low-income energy users, and a variety of other programs that can help advance cleaner energy goals. California similarly has its own program using a cap and a trade system to generate carbon revenues that they're using again for a variety of clean energy purposes, and they're targeting an environmental justice component through those carbon revenues where they're putting money to use in low-income and minority neighborhoods for things like clean transit, clean energy, energy efficiency. So there are some really important examples already there in the U.S., and what the Clean Power Plan does is create the opportunity for other states who want to take advantage of this experience to build or connect with existing programs or build their own programs. Where we are right now in the process is that states now have a year in which to either file a compliance plan with the EPA by September next year or ask for an extension with an interim plan. And they can get extensions for up to 2 years until September of 2018 to file their final plan. We've been doing a number of analyses at UCS to point out the opportunity that states have in terms of drawing up these compliance plans. And one of the things we did was we did an analysis called States of Progress, where we looked at current clean energy commitments that states are already making, things like state renewable electricity standards, state energy efficiency resource standards, commitments that they'd made to retire coal-fired power plants. And what we found was that just through these existing commitments, not new but existing commitments, 31 states, so a majority of the states, are already on track to be more than halfway to meeting what their 2022 emission reduction requirement is under the Clean Power Plan, their benchmark. And 20 states are on track to be more than halfway towards their 2030, the final targets in the Clean Power Plan. So this means that many states are very well positioned to comply with the Clean Power Plan through existing commitments and then the opportunity to go further by investing in renewables and energy efficiency. We're encouraging states to consider these options and prioritize them, as well as work together with other states to find low-cost options. The electricity grid is already interconnected on a regional basis, and so multi-state solutions come naturally to states that are taking steps to clean up their energy mix. The Clean Power Plan is, of course, very significant. We also think it's a down payment on where the U.S. Power sector needs to go over the long term. And we're pointing out a few things going forward. One is, as I mentioned, the risks of over-relying on natural gas. Natural gas has a very important role to play as we clean up our electricity mix. However, it's still a fossil fuel. It does also come with methane leakage concerns. There are additional environmental and public health concerns associated with exploiting natural gas. And very significantly, there are consumer risks because if we shift generation to natural gas in a very big way, if there's a rush to gas, then whenever there are price spikes, those impacts are felt by consumers on their electricity bill. So we've been pointing out the importance of having a diversified energy mix, as well as the fact that electricity infrastructure is long-lived. So choices we're making today in our infrastructure are going to be around for a while, and we want to pivot that infrastructure to low-carbon energy sources. Otherwise, we'll be left with a lot of stranded assets, a lot of pipelines or power plants that aren't useful anymore in a low-carbon world. And that's why we're seeing the Clean Power Plan as a first very important, significant step, but an opportunity also to go further post-2025 and definitely post-2030. And there are a number of ways we could do this. We also see a really important opportunity to put a national price on carbon so that we're orienting our whole economy towards a cleaner energy mix. We've currently been operating in an environment that's where fossil fuel interests have been putting up a lot of obstacles to progress on clean energy. They've been fighting the Clean Power Plan tooth and nail, including participating in legal challenges to it. We're also seeing them oppose state renewable electricity standards. And so there is a lot of opposition to progress, and we really need to take this moment and break through that and point out the opportunity for states and the benefits that states will derive, both in terms of economic benefits and consumer benefits from the switch to clean energy, but very significantly the huge public health benefits of making this transition to clean energy. So for example, the Clean Power Plan, EPA has estimated will bring public health and climate benefits worth an estimated 26 to 45 billion per year in 2030. And a lot of that is coming both from cutting CO2, but also from cutting co-pollutants like sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides. And as we make this transition, we can also help moderate impacts on consumer electricity bills. But to do all this, we really have to break through a lot of the misinformation that fossil fuel interests have been putting out there. And that's another key piece of the work that UCS does. The fact-checking, set the record straight, point out how the costs of renewables are falling, point out the need to configure our electricity system in a way that serves consumers the best over the long term. And one of the ways in which we're also doing this is to point out that in a warming world, there are certain kinds of electricity assets that would put us in a better position to be more resilient. So just last month, we released a report called Lights Out that was looking at the threats from climate change to our electricity grids, including things like extreme weather events and coastal flooding. And in that context as well, shifting our investments to renewables, to distributed generation, investing in energy efficiency, alongside hardening our grid in general, will be very important solutions. We are also exploring more deep decarbonization pathways for the U.S. Towards the mid-century and beyond. in this work, one of the things we're trying to do is look at scenarios of cutting emissions as much as 85 to 90% below 2005 levels, and recognize the fact that as we make economy-wide cuts in our emissions, we're going to need to electrify a lot of end users, including transportation, industrial, and other end users. And that means that we have to not only decarbonize the power sector, but we have to do it while taking on a great deal of additional demand to the power sector. Some studies have estimated that we might need to double electricity demand by mid-century. So it's a significant challenge, but it's one that we think we can get well on the pathway towards with existing technologies and policies. And with further investments, R&D, storage, grid investments, infrastructure investments, we can take it much further by mid-century and beyond. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rachel. All right, so we're now going to open it up for questions. We have a lot of thoughtful questions that came in. And so what I'm going to do is phrase a question. I may paraphrase it a little bit, and then I'll ask one of our panelists to take it. And one of them is a personal favorite of mine, so I may take that one. But Alden, what I'd like to do is ask our panelists to try to give relatively short, crisp answers so that we can get to a bunch of these questions, because I know we're done at 2 o'clock. So, Alden, there was a question about China, and the question was, China's not really going to start reducing its emissions till 2030, so how can this agreement be a success under those circumstances?
Okay, thanks, Ken. Actually, the premise of the question is not correct. China has put a commitment to peak its emissions no later than 2030, but its emissions have been increasing rapidly because of the growth of its economy in recent years. So actually, to achieve that peak, which we think actually China can do well before 2030, in the mid-2020s, China has to take tremendous action at home. Just to give you one example, in the announcement last year, the U.S. and China joint announcement with President Xi and Obama, China committed to get 20% of its electricity by 2030 from non-fossil resources, including renewables, nuclear, and others. That is likely to represent almost the entire installed generating capacity of the U.S. by that point. China is the most rapidly growing market for renewable energy technology in the world, and of course, that development in China has helped drive down renewable energy technology costs worldwide. So the notion that some Republicans in Congress and others that oppose action in Paris are putting forward that China is actually required to do very little under the agreement reached with the United States is totally incorrect. China has to do a heroic amount. And of course, we hope that China and India and others, including the U.S., will do more than they've committed to do, which is one of the reasons we're fighting for this 5-year review process. But China has already committed to do a tremendous amount under its bilateral announcement with the U.S.
Thank you. And Alden, a second question for you. One of the people on the phone noted the constraints in terms of getting Congress to go along with the U.S. commitment to the $100 billion. But what about the private sector?
Well, there actually is a lot that the administration has been doing with the amount of public money that it does have approval from Congress with to leverage private sector investment, buying down some of the risk of capital investment in developing economies and other notions. So there's a lot that the private sector is doing. Actually, there's a number of banks and insurance companies that have committed to move substantial amounts of money into clean technologies. There's likely to be a very significant announcement on the first day of the Paris meeting, coordinated by the government of India with a number of countries and companies announcing a major commitment of capital over the next 15 years to renewable energy deployment. We know that the private sector is going to have to do the lion's share of the lift in decarbonizing the global economy, but the private sector money can really play a very important leverage role, which is why we have to fight to convince the Congress that it's in our interest to not only maintain but expand that support going forward.
Great, thank you. We then got a couple of different questions that all get kind of at the same thing, and I'm going to take a crack at them. But the questions are, what could the next president do to derail this climate agreement if he or she wished, and what can the current Congress do to derail it. So I'm going to take an initial crack at that, and if the panelists would like to join in, that's fine too. So one thing I want to point out is that these regulations that we've been talking about, the Clean Power Plan, the fuel economy standards, these are regulations that have the force of law. And an incoming president, for example, doesn't have the authority to just erase those regulations with the stroke of a pen. To take them off the books would require a new president to go through the lengthy rulemaking process that was required actually to put them on the books. This is one instance where the fact that things move slowly in Washington actually works to our advantage. It would take a long time to undo these. It's also really important to point out that these regulations are popular and are supported by wide majorities of the population, and so the idea that a divided Congress could find the type of supermajority that would be needed to repeal them is also very, very limited. With the Clean Power Plan in particular, you're seeing already utilities and states rolling up their sleeves and putting together implementation plans. And certainly utility companies value above all stability and predictability. And so in a couple of years' time, the idea that the Clean Power Plan would then be repealed and we'd start over with something new will really be anathema to these companies. And then the other thing people should know, which is helpful, is that these regulations also, if a new president decided not to enforce them, the Federal Clean Air Act gives citizens, ordinary citizens, environmental groups, and others the right to enforce these rules. So it seems unlikely that these linchpin elements of our pledge could be completely negated. So that's the good news. Now the bad news is there still could be an effort to undo them. It seems unlikely that today's Congress will be able to muster enough votes to do that, but we don't know exactly what will happen, of course, in the election. But I think for now, I think it's fair to say that the commitments that the President has made are locked in, and the world should have some confidence that at least for the next few years, we can stick to them and hopefully expand upon them. So I'm going to now turn to Rachel. There was a question raised about carbon pricing. What is UCS's position on carbon pricing, either a tax or a cap and trade, and what types of things are we doing to support that position?
Sure. So yes, we certainly do see a price on carbon as a very important strategy to help cut carbon emissions, orient investor decisions towards cleaner energy, drive a lot of innovation around clean energy, and as a bonus, generate carbon revenues that can be used for public benefits. So we've got existing models of this, as I mentioned, both in California and in the 9 Northeast RGGI states that have shown that this can be done. We have examples all around the world. In fact, we have the EU ETS. China has now said that it will implement a national cap and trade program. So this is a very significant tool. And it can help drive a lot of renewable energy and energy efficiency as well. We do recognize that the current U.S. political climate being as it is, the prospects in Congress seem rather dim right now, but that's no reason for us not to press forward in advocating for it, and we certainly will continue to do that alongside a lot of other folks, including a lot of business voices and conservative voices who see this market-based tool as a very effective and tool to cut carbon, but also one that works very well with our market-based system here in the U.S. So we will certainly be advocating for it. And in fact, the Clean Power Plan allows the flexibility for states to take advantage of this option, and we expect that it will be one that many states will have an interest in. And these state activities will be the vanguard of what we hope will eventually be a national price on carbon. Thank you.
Don, a question for you. a participant asks, what is being considered about freight and passenger rail transport and about air travel, and how important are these sectors?
Yeah, good question. The bulk of the transportation emissions come from cars and trucks. Passenger cars and trucks are about 60% of transportation emissions, and then an additional 15% or so come from heavy-duty trucks, and then the rest is kind of made up of air, marine, and rail. So it's a smaller portion of the emissions, and in the near term, probably wouldn't see a large reduction from those sectors, say, in the 2025 timeframe. But one of the key things there is that freight transportation is projected to continue to grow, obviously with population and the economy expanding as population grows. So it becomes more important beyond 2025. What is being done right now, EPA is moving forward with a proposal to address climate emissions from aircraft. So that is a positive development that will be happening over the next couple of years. Specifically on rail, I'm not aware of any specific regulatory process at EPA. However, California is in the process of developing a sustainable freight strategy, which is really looking at the entire freight system in California and considering fuels, vehicle technologies, efficiency measures to address freight emissions. So that's really an exciting area that we're engaged on out here in California that I think will have significant implications for the potential solutions that other states and the nation can take on going forward.
Thanks, Don. Alden, back to you. One of the participants noting the New York Times article yesterday that talked about how even if all of the countries stick to their pledges, we'd be on a path of about, the commentator says, about 6.3 degrees Fahrenheit. I know people switch back and forth between Celsius and Fahrenheit, but his question's in Fahrenheit. He or she is saying this is far off from the 2010 commitment to aim for only 3.5 Fahrenheit degrees of warming, which is the 2 degrees Celsius. Do you think that this prediction of 6.3 Fahrenheit is valid, and how can it be addressed?
Well, when you get into the predictions, as I think it was Mark Twain had said, predictions are very difficult, especially about the future, and that goes in spades here for this kind of analysis because it depends heavily. Remember, these numbers are framed in terms of global temperature increase by 2100. And so these analyses are affected heavily by assumptions about what happens after 2030, particularly in major economies like the U.S., China, India, and elsewhere. That being said, it's very clear that even between now and 2030, there is an ambition gap. I talked about that a little bit in my opening remarks. The United Nations Environment Program says that to have a greater than 66% chance of keeping temperature increases below 2 degrees Celsius or 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit, we need to be shooting for emissions in 2030 of no more than 42 gigatons carbon equivalent. And right now we're emitting about 50 tons globally, so that's somewhat of a reduction. But the predictions are based on the efforts that countries are undertaking in the proposals they've put forward in the run-up to Paris, is that emissions will be somewhere in the 54 to 56 gigaton range in 2030, which is a reduction for where they would have been without those actions, but obviously it's nowhere near enough. So that's why we're looking for actions in Paris which will encourage countries to come back and revise their level of ambition relatively quickly, not wait until 2025 or 2030 to take another look at what they can do. As I said, the rapid drop in renewable technology costs, that means even with that factor alone, we should be able to do more than we think we can now if we look at it again by the end of this decade. And as I said, there's a lot of things that can be done over the next few years to help countries like India that want to bend their emissions curve as they continue to lift people out of poverty through investment in energy efficiency and renewable energy technologies. So the good news is people know there's a gap. It's not hidden. It's out there very publicly, and there's a lot of pressure on leaders to have some answers coming out of Paris about how they're going to address that gap. How effective and convincing those answers will be remains to be seen, and as I said, there will be a lot of work to do after Paris to capitalize on whatever momentum we have from the agreement itself to do more implementation on the ground, not only here at home, as Don and Rachel were talking about, but around the world, particularly in the major emerging developing countries.
Alden, thank you. And this is, I think, the very first time that I've known you. I have to correct one thing you said. The person who made that quote about predicting the future was Yogi Berra, not Mark Twain.
Oh, there you go. Well, there you go. I stand corrected.
But otherwise, thank you. Alden, I have another question for you that our listeners have been asking about. How do we know that countries are going to keep these pledges? How will it be enforced? How will it be monitored?
Sure. That actually has been a priority for President Obama and his team since they came in, and actually that was a lot of the drama 6 years ago in Copenhagen when the President and Hillary Clinton stormed into a meeting of the major economy leaders near the end of that talk to demand that there be an agreement on reporting and transparency. And the good news is that going into Paris, there seems to be growing consensus that we need to upgrade the reporting and verification standards for major developing countries up to the levels that industrialized countries like the U.S. now have to meet. That will take some time and investment and capacity in those countries, as we saw recently with China. They are still grappling to figure out exactly what their emission trends are and their coal consumption. So that's a work in progress. But the good news is there's not ideological resistance to that from most countries. It's a question of what the transition period is, what kind of carve-out or exemption there may be for the poorest countries in the world, and what assistance those countries need to develop their monitoring regimes. Of course, here in the U.S., we have real-time monitoring of carbon emissions on every power plant smokestack. The EPA knows exactly what's happening. That's not the case in a country like China or India. So it's going to take investment. It's going to take capability. The EPA and California and other experts are providing technical assistance to those countries in developing their monitoring regime, but this is a key priority for the administration and for the business community, I should add, coming out of Paris, that we have pretty robust reporting and verification standards.
Okay, last question, and I'll pose it to all three of you and ask you to give short answers. What can people who are listening to this call do, let's say after the agreement is struck, to make sure that in the aftermath it's a success?
Well, Alden, I guess I'll start. I mean, I think here at home, obviously, as I said, we're going into an election year, and this is not only the presidential election, but the Senate, the House, local elections. I think it's very important that people push candidates from both parties to say what they would do to continue to address this problem and to build on the successes that Don and Rachel talked about in the power and transportation sectors. We need to show that there's tremendous public support and demand actually for climate solutions here in the United States, because even if we succeed in Paris, we're going to have a lot more to do to demonstrate American leadership going forward.
This is Rachel. I couldn't agree more. I think we absolutely have to continue to push for leaders here at home to have greater ambition to address climate change. And one key piece is, in addition to cutting our emissions aggressively and helping countries around the world as well to do that, we have locked in a fair amount of climate change, and those impacts are being felt already around the U.S. and around the globe. And I think we have to also invest in better preparing and protecting communities both here in the U.S. As well as in other countries, especially developing countries.
Yeah, and I would just add to that from a transportation sector perspective, really re-emphasizing the critical nature of the fuel economy standards and keeping those strong and ensuring that there is vocal, broad public support for that as they go through review over the next several years is key. And then, of course, on a personal level, if you're shopping for a new vehicle, look for one that's highly efficient or one that you can plug in.
Well, thank you, Don and Rachel and Alden, and thank all of our guests who participated, and thank you for your questions and your interest. I think we're out of time now, so I'm going to wrap this up, but I would ask you to stay involved. One good way you can do that is to check our blog, and that's blog.ucsusa.org. Rachel has posted a blog on Paris. I posted a blog, and I think you'll see other ones coming out over the next couple of weeks that will keep you posted on what's happening. And we will also be sending out action alerts and other social media information to all of our supporters. So thank you once again for participating, and let's all keep our fingers crossed for a very successful agreement in Paris, and then roll up our sleeves and make sure it gets implemented and strengthened over time. So thank you again. Appreciate your interest in this important subject.